PRovoke podcast is brought to you by PRovoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialists Marketeers. Support for this podcast comes from Notified, the integrated, intelligent and easy-to-use PR software. Get a free demo today at notified.com.
Welcome to the PRovoke Media podcast. This is Arun Sudhaman, Editor-in-Chief. I'm here in Hong Kong and very happy to be joined by Genevieve Hilton, who's the Head of Communications for Asia-Pacific at Lenovo. Genevieve, welcome to the podcast. This is the first in-person podcast that I've done in 18 months.
Delighted to be here, and it feels very strange, doesn't it?
It does feel strange, but it feels fun, actually, to not have to talk to someone through a screen.
It can be a source of eye strain.
Yeah, it can. And now I feel we can pick up on visual cues and all that kind of stuff that I think we have become used to living without, which makes it for a different kind of conversation, hopefully.
I'll try not to take advantage of it for the ability to interrupt each other, which is also something it's harder to do on screen.
Yeah, well, please feel free to interrupt me whenever you choose to. Thank you for joining the podcast. I wanted to talk to you about a few things, actually. I mean, first of all, I wanted to talk to you about your career. You joined Lenovo. Has it been 2 years yet?
Yeah, it's been a bit over 2 years already.
Right, okay. And before that, you were with BASF for a decade?
Yeah, more than that as well. That was my first in-house job after being with agency my whole PR life or communications life.
So 12 years in-house. Before that, you were with
before that,
a few different
I was
agencies.
Most recently with Ketchum, Greater China.
Right.
And before that, I was running my own agency for a couple of years, which then later became part of Ketchum. And before that, I was when I first came to Hong Kong, this would have been around end of 99 or 2000, I was working with Octagon Prism, which was part of the IPG.
Sure.
But that was really the beginning of my Hong Kong career as well. I think before that I'd been in Vietnam for about 5 or 6 years and working for a small local agency there.
All Rivers.
Yes, that was the one. Yes,
I recall. For some reason in my contact book you're still listed under All Rivers. So
well, the name actually came from a very simple origin. My business partner's name was Duan, and my Vietnamese name was Giang, and Duan Giang is a very, very traditional, old-fashioned way to name a shop that's run by Duan and Giang. And so it was kind of a joke, like we're just this really low-key, traditional shop, selling whatever plastic gewgaws or something like that, but doing this very strange thing. Well, it's a very strange and unusual thing at the time to be doing in Vietnam was offering public relations.
Yeah, that is a whole different conversation. I don't know if you still follow the Vietnamese public relations market in much.
A little bit. I don't get there very often, and obviously not in the last 2 years. But
yeah, it's an interesting market. It's kind of in fits and starts, I think. But I think that's probably a conversation for another day. So you've done 12 years, more than 12 years in-house.
More than that now, yeah.
And many agencies. So start with the really obvious question. How do you find the big differences when it comes to working in-house versus working agency side?
So one of the things that I originally went in-house to do was to make myself a better agency person. And that was kind of my idea at the time, is that, well, maybe in-house seems dreadful, and I never wanted to work on the client side because it seemed like they were always under such pressure and it was terrible. But I thought after, this would have been in late 2007, I thought, well, maybe I'll give it a try, and went to work for BASF and found that I liked it very much, and unexpectedly so. So it was like working for my favorite client all the time instead of just every so many hours per day. But probably the biggest thing I didn't even think about was that at a certain point, sometime in my first couple of weeks in-house, I realized I don't have to fill in timesheets. And it was like this enormous weight was lifted from my shoulders. I mean, of course, there's some sort of timekeeping system. You don't want to spend too much time on one business unit or another business unit. But the grind of having to fill in those 15-minute or 10-minute intervals was lifted from me forever, and that's something I would have a lot of trouble going back to now.
Yeah, I spent 1 year at an agency, and even in just that short period of time, I found timesheets were by far the worst thing of all.
But I mean, on the other hand, when you're working in an agency, you are the heart of the business. You are the revenue generator of the business. You are what the business does. Whereas when you are in-house, you are a function. And so the business really does something else, whether it's they make chemicals or they make and sell computers and sell IT services. But the communications person enables that rather than doing the core thing of the company.
Are you perceived as a cost in-house rather than a source of value?
You know, the one thing about communications, which is a little bit funny, is that it's not particularly expensive, especially which you shouldn't, but if you did, you could compare it to marketing. Marketing spends a lot of money. And the actual day-to-day spend of dollars on marketing is, so completely overwhelms communications that I don't think communications is the first thing that people think, like, oh, what's that big expensive thing we have to look at as a cost. Communication isn't the first thing that comes to mind. I think the advertising people have that.
Do you think that benefits marketing at all? That it is more expensive, and so therefore perhaps there's more of a,
I think
that kind of perceived
sometimes,
value?
If someone spends so much, then they have to justify it to themselves, and they start to believe it. So therefore, it must be worth more if I spend so much money on it.
Well, it's like buying a more expensive TV, isn't it?
I had to have that TV.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How has the value of communications changed over the past 18 months during the pandemic? We've run various research studies, and in all of them, the in-house respondents have all said that they have never felt more valued and that their roles have been more important.
I must assume that it's different from company to company, but at least in the long-term experience I've had, the communications team is never more valued than when the crisis comes. And if I want to be a little bit cynical, you don't let that go to waste. You take the opportunity to build up the relationships with the senior management, and help them understand how communications works. And for that reason, I guess that would explain why a lot of the in-house people you've talked to have said communications has never been more valued, particularly internal communications. So if anything, I would say it's the internal communications function that probably is getting the biggest boost from this, because it is, people suddenly realize, like, oh, this is how, this is really important. It may be not only a matter of, celebrating the achievements of the boss, but rather this is a life and death matter where we have to make sure people are safe. And understand the subtleties and the art that goes into it, whereas just a couple of words in a memo can make a huge difference to how people feel about the company.
Yes, quite a few. There's a few interesting strands there that are worth exploring a little bit further. So the perceived value as linked to crisis mode, is that a good thing for the communications function? Because it suggests that I don't want to be too reductive, but it suggests that they're only valuable when there's bad news around, or at least that they're seen as being more valuable.
Think so. And in fact, if the communications team is, does it the right way, they will permanently increase their value in the eyes of management. And there's nothing like being up until 2 a.m. in a boardroom eating old cold pizza together that creates a bond between the senior management and the communications team, and that's a bond that sticks. So I don't think that there's a negative in that. And it also helps the communications team afterwards, if they do what they should, say, now let's look at this and see how we can make ourselves stronger and better organized for future crises. And that process, I think, is good for the whole company.
Yeah, sure. Is it sustainable? One of the questions that emerges is whether the communications function will remain valuable after the pandemic passes. And again, I think this probably refers to companies where maybe it's seen a huge jump in how it's seen because of the pandemic. Is that a valid question, do you think?
I think it will remain as long as the same people are in charge. So companies have a very low level of institutional memory, or lower than you might expect. And the person who's been through a crisis with a communicator will value communications for life. But if then that person goes to a different role, the new one who comes in isn't necessarily going to have that same attitude, and that person will need to be educated anew. So in that sense, the fact that everybody had the pandemic might be a good thing for communications until they all start retiring in a few years.
Yeah, this has always been one of these things we've seen where, the CEO will move companies, and then before you know it, the CCO has joined the CEO at the new company, and often that's framed as a positive thing, or that CCO really understands the CEO and is the CEO's right-hand person and so on. But of course the question is, how does that impact the institutional communications knowledge in the corporate world in general?
Well, I think it often depends on what the role of that most senior communicator is and is expected to be by the CEO. So there are often, I think in a lot of companies, there are two people, one who deals with the senior management and the other one who runs the communications function. And when I talk about institutional knowledge, systems, processes, how we do communications, how things are run, it's often that second person who runs that. It's the first person who follows the CEO to the next job.
Right. Okay.
And both of these, and I'm not saying either of these are better, but they're different. They're different roles. Sometimes it's in a single person, and when it's in that single person, and that person follows the CEO, then I think that there's there's going to be a lot lost at the company that remains.
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon, but you do wonder what its impact is in the long term.
Well, think of it in a positive way. If that person was doing a great job at the previous company, they're bringing all that knowledge and wealth of expertise to the next company.
Yeah, no question. What are the changes you've seen? Obviously you work at Lenovo, which is technically a Chinese company? Is a Chinese company?
Technically, it's listed in Hong Kong. But I think that Lenovo is it's unique in its being, Lenovo, I think it's the world's one true multinational. We have 4 big business groups. The 4 heads of the business groups live on 4 different continents. The CFO is here, the head of legal is in Washington, D.C., the head of the PC and intelligent devices unit sits in Italy, head of the mobile phones group sits in Brazil. So it's one of these, it's a very modern phenomenon, which I think goes exactly to your question, like how are things changing? This complete and proper globalization is, I think, going to affect communications in a very fundamental way. And I think we're seeing at companies like Lenovo, who are a little bit ahead of the game, or a little bit more, I don't want to say more advanced, but are further down that path of globalization. Then you see it's something very different from what it was a few years ago. I have to only do an interview when the CEO is in town. Or I remember giving advice to one of my agency team members, this would have been probably 2003, that it's always great when pitching a journalist to say that such and such an executive is flying in, and it gave it some immediacy. You have to interview him now because he's only going to be in town for a couple days. Can't do that anymore.
That's all changed.
It's
now.
out the window.
And of course, in the virtual world that we're living in now, you could argue that makes things even more globalized or differently
Exactly, yeah.
globalized.
But it also has, I think, an enormous advantage as well. I mean, we at Lenovo, we have a couple of people, well, actually a big team of people, I think like a lot of multinationals do, who are really top experts in one really interesting, cool thing. But there's only one of them. The head of the product diversity office. So she's the one who checks whether all the products can be used by, for example, people with disabilities, or does the AI recognize your face no matter what color you are, that kind of stuff.
Sure.
So that office is getting bigger, but like right now there's only one head of that office. So do we have to wait for her to fly around the world to do an interview? No, we actually did a couple of interviews with her not too long ago in India, all by using Teams, using Zoom, and it was a topic of great interest to the Indian media, and I think everybody was happy with the results, including the journalist, including the product diversity head. And we would have had to, in the past we might never have even considered her, because I don't think she would have traveled all that much anyway.
Right. I think with a company like Lenovo, as you've described, you're probably a little bit ahead of the curve. With many of the other MNCs we see, it is still quite directed from HQ, and that's often North America. So presumably it does require some kind of a mindset change.
I think so, yeah. But being directed from HQ versus to what extent can you take advantage of the globalization are not necessarily the same question. So if I were an enlightened person from headquarters, I might be ruling with an iron fist, but still saying like, okay, you in Japan interview this person from from Italy, and you in Korea interview this person from Brazil. I could be doing that no matter where I was located, but I think that's a different question.
Yep.
So, I think ultimately it's the mindset does have to change, and it has to change sort of everywhere simultaneously, because on one hand you need the local communications team to think this is possible and be able to pitch to the journalist, for example, and how to put it into their plan as one option. And on the other hand, you need spokespeople from wherever who are willing to open their minds a little bit and talk to someone from a completely different market, and get out of their whatever their home country is.
So that's one question. If we look at the other question, do you think that, for example, it's better for big MNCs to have a more decentralized approach to communications?
So we often talk about this. What is the role of the either the global or the regional communications person? And I used to describe it as being half consultant, half police officer. So, and then that would be maybe the Asia-Pacific person, and then the global would set the policy. So they would be the government, so to speak. So the global team should provide service to the local and regional markets, but also set the policy. And having those policies in place, I think, is very important, because it gives everyone a common understanding and a common framework, and it makes things easier, not always having to second guess and question every single step of the way. You just want to get stuff done. Whereas maybe the regional communications team should act as the consultant, the facilitator, the coordinator, and yes, to a certain extent, the policy enforcer for all of the local markets, so that the local markets can create their strategies, get the resources they need from the regional or the global team, and know that they are safely operating within something that won't, is not going to cause trouble.
How do you find it when you're staffing up those local markets? Have you seen a change in, for example, the quality of talent that's available? People that want to work in comms, people that want to work in comms for Lenovo?
Certainly, I happen to be recruiting in India right now. And one of the biggest changes I've seen in that market, for example, is how many people I'm getting as how many applicants I'm getting who have experience not only working for a local agency or for a local office, but working in global roles in India for an Indian company. And that's been really cool, because it means I have people who are understanding both sides of the situation. Like I've always thought that it makes me a better Asia-Pacific communicator for having been in Vietnam and been like on the last receiving end of the of the cascade of information that is like, oh, these guys from global again, these guys from Asia-Pacific again. So having been in that situation, it helps me a lot to understand as an Asia-Pacific communicator what are the needs of the local market. But on the other hand, if I have someone in India who's going to be doing, for example, an India communications job, why, it's fantastic if they've had experience in a regional or a global role, because they'll also understand the other way around.
So that's quite a big shift.
That's a huge shift. And I didn't see that even 10 years ago. I didn't see that.
So that suggests that the quality of talent has improved. Are you seeing any specific impact from the pandemic in terms of people wanting to leave or people rethinking their careers?
If anything, there's probably an increased level of burnout because it's been so hard and it's been so relentless. And being in the technology industry, we actually had a funny situation, is that the industry is booming, and we're having the trouble of like supplying all the demand, which is a great problem to have. Whereas other companies, let's say aviation or hospitality, are hit in a completely different way. So they have the stress of an extended crisis, plus the company isn't doing very well. And that level of burnout, I think, must be very, very tough. And certainly I've seen, I think people haven't been firing their communicators because they need them, but being that one who's having to oversee layoffs, that's a tough. Really tough job, and it's emotionally draining.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem like there's an easy solution to this.
I don't think so. And I think the other thing with working from home means that everybody who used to be able to handle their work-life balance can't anymore.
Yes, indeed. I want to switch tracks for a second, because you spoke at our Asia-Pacific conference around 3 weeks ago, I think.
Yes, great event, by the way.
Thank you very much. It was great to be back in person. That was a lot of fun. But you said you said a lot of interesting things, but one thing in particular that stuck with me, we were talking about the role of the communications head as the conscience of an organization, and this is a sort of a popular theme or trope.
Right.
It's the kind of thing that they love at the Page Society because it's like a higher calling for communications. But you pointed out that potentially that perception is gendered in a way that isn't necessarily helpful. I wondered if you could just perhaps explain that to our listeners.
Well, I guess the thing is, yes, we all love to think we are the virtuous ones with the higher calling, who are the acting as the what is representing what is good and right and true. I think every one of us would love to think that about ourselves. But when it goes from a voluntary thing to an expectation, then I think that's where we have to be a little bit careful. And if the CEO thinks, I don't have to think about ethics, that's the communications person's job to remind me, that is definitely no good for anybody. And as I mentioned during the conference, it is potentially, not in every case, but it is potentially there, you can see this through a gender lens, because the women are the ones who will keep us upright and virtuous, while the barbarian men can go out and do as they like, pillaging the pillaging the land, and that's not doing anybody any good. And it creates there's a very strange dynamic there sometimes. So I would rather think of the communications people as having it in their sort of secret job description, but not in their overt job description.
Right.
And in the sense that the communications people, to a greater or lesser extent, they represent the voice of the outside or the inside world to the CEO. So maybe the investor relations represent the voice of the investors. The communications team, marketing maybe or sales represents the voice of the customers. The communications team represents the voice of kind of society and the employees.
Yeah.
And in that sense, yes, that is kind of a conscience. You can put it that way.
It sounds like this is something you have experienced before, where perhaps you felt that maybe in a room of men, you've been expected to kind of be the person with the sort of moral viewpoint.
I've certainly experienced being the only woman in a room of men who are all more senior than me. I don't know that it was obvious that I was the one who was bringing the moral framework. That's more of let's say, a general societal or philosophical observation. But I think it's something we need to watch out for.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of times that all of our unconscious biases, and again, everybody's got them, can create expectations of the other people who are in the room with you're in the room with that you don't even think about until maybe someone points it out to you years later.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point and actually a really important one, and not one that I've seen made before. So I think that hopefully it's something that communicators like yourselves and the industry in general takes on board. Another area where we see communications perhaps embracing more responsibility, let's say, is around sustainability. Do you think it always makes sense for sustainability and communications roles to go hand in hand? Because that seems to be a trend we're seeing more of, particularly as the kind of ESG agenda becomes more and more popular.
Well, I am always very reluctant to say that communications and sustainability should be merged, or that one person should be in charge of both. And one of the reasons is that then sustainability risks being thought of as only a thing we talk about, rather than a thing we do. So sustainability, or ESG, or to use the old-fashioned terms, corporate responsibility, in my mind should be something more like a philosophy of the business, or a set of guiding principles of the business, which is seen in every single part of the business. So, I mean, let's take, just drilling down on one particular area, let's say diversity and inclusion is one part of sustainability. It shouldn't be done only by the diversity and inclusion department. So, like I mentioned a minute ago, the product diversity lead is someone who ensures that the products and the solutions are inclusive enough. Maybe the HR team has to look at it from, a training point of view, but also the recruitment team has to look at it from a talent acquisition point of view, and the maybe the investor relations team has to look at it from a investor point of view, and yes, the communications team has to look at it from a communications point of view. For example, do I use a stock photo that I send out with my press release, and in that photo do I show dad with his laptop and mom washing dishes? So each and every person in the team has to do their own bit and do their own effort. So for that reason, I hesitate to say the sustainability should be combined with communications automatically. Nevertheless, I see it's happening a lot. So I think it works in some cases, and it really depends on the company. And I think it's a little bit, it opens a door potentially for sustainability to be seen only, it opens the door for greenwashing. Right. And which I think is it's a very dangerous door to have open.
Yeah. And ESG washing, we talked about that at the conference, that is a real thing.
Oh yeah.
And of course, with DE&I, we see a lot of talk, a lot of rhetoric.
Yep.
Sometimes not as much action. I mean, in the comms world, we see quite a lot of that, because this isn't an industry with a great record, and yet it can have such a huge impact on DE&I.
Well, I mean, I guess that's what I'm talking about. The responsibility within that sphere of influence, absolutely. So, do I, do I make sure that I use the power of communications to promote solutions that help the customers achieve their own sustainability goals? Absolutely. That is my responsibility as part of the overall sustainability actions of my department. Do I help write the ESG report in such a way that it actually addresses the needs of the stakeholders? Absolutely. And it's not a confusing jumble of terminology and long tables with numbers. Yeah. But is the communications department the only one responsible for it? Absolutely not. Should not be.
Yeah. And how do you feel about the industry's record in terms of DE? And I'm particularly looking at things here in Asia. It seems to me like on the in-house side, things are a lot better than on the agency side. I don't know if it's that simple.
I think that if you look at it positively, then in your typical agency, like 90% of the account executives are female. And then by the time you get to the, say, managing director of an agency, then it's like 50% are female. So when I say positively, like have managing directors who are 50% female, that's pretty good. And so we do have, for example, female role models in management. We have boardrooms in which there is not only one gender represented. On the other hand, that's a lot of attrition. And do we need to account for that only by only in terms of like, oh yeah, the women just want to quit and have babies? And I don't think so. I think it's all of the societal forces act on the communications industry just as they do on every other industry. But having said that, is it better in Asia? I don't know, because I haven't worked in the United States, for example. But certainly I seem to see just as many male and female communications heads inside, in agencies and in-house as well. I mean, you probably see this in your position because you talk to them every day.
Well, interestingly, we've got some data coming out this week on the pay gap and promotion gap at agencies only in Asia, and so we can compare it to North America, for example. But it's difficult to compare. You can't really come up with a global kind of thing, but you can compare regions certainly, and so we will do that, and that will be interesting. But we haven't been able to do that for the in-house side. There's
maybe one thing that one anecdote I would like to bring up. It's a few years ago. I was. And it's. I guess I wanted to identify that there is still a gap, and it's maybe not the one you'd expect. And a few years ago, I was organizing a conference for IABC, and I was in charge of recruiting the speakers. And I opened up the field. I sent, I think, about 20 invitations, and out of those 20 invitations, I think 15 of them were to women and 5 to men. And for the first 15, I got no responses at first, and then after a little while they trickled in. A few people said they couldn't do it because of the date. One person said that she didn't think she was qualified. Another one said that she thought I should ask her boss rather than her, who was a man. Guess what? All 5 of the guys said yes immediately. And I've often wondered, what was the cause behind that? And it's something that we need to think about in terms of giving women who are communicators more visibility at every level, because there's that dynamic happening whether we like it or not. This exists.
Imposter syndrome that perhaps has a gender aspect to it as well. I think we're going to get kicked out of this room, unfortunately.
But that's the challenge of the real world.
This wouldn't have happened on Zoom.
This would not happen on Zoom, exactly.
Genevieve, thank you so much for your time. We'll do this again because I feel like we probably have more things we can talk about. But yeah, I really hope you enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, very much so. I'm looking forward to speaking again.
Thank you.
You have been listening to the PRovoke podcast, brought to you by PRovoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialists Marketeers. Support for this podcast comes from Notified, the integrated, intelligent and easy-to-use PR software. Get a free demo today at notified.com.